Hello and welcome to Province House. I am Peter Theriault of House of Assembly Operations. Welcome to your tour. Province House is home to Canada's oldest legislative assembly. The building opened in the year 1819, making it Canada's oldest legislative building. This is the foyer. The foyer is paved with black limestone and white marble. The point of interest is that the limestone contains fossils. Let's proceed to the second floor. This is the Red Chamber. The Red Chamber was once home to Nova Scotia's upper house, which we called the Legislative Council. This body ceased to exist in the year 1928. Since that time, we've used this room for a variety of purposes, the most significant of which are committee meetings of the House of Assembly. Two such committees are the Committee on Law Amendments and the Subcommittee on Supply, which helps debate the budget. If we look about the room, we will see various points of interest. I'll turn your attention to the front of the room. Here we have a table that dates back to the founding of the city in 1749. It was around this table that Nova Scotia's governing council met on board the ship Beaufort. Beyond this table, we have two throne chairs. These chairs are identical with the obvious exception of the crowns on the backs of the chairs. The chair to the left was first used during the visit of the Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VII. The chair to the right was first used in 1939 for the visit of King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, our current Queen's mother. The similarities in the chairs are important because the crown on the left is St. Edward's crown, while the crown on the right is the imperial state crown. Behind the chairs, we have two paintings, King George III and his consort, Queen Charlotte. King George III was the monarch reigning in England when the building opened in 1819. His reign lasted from 1760 to 1820, making him England's third longest reigning monarch. To the right is his wife or consort, Queen Charlotte, for whom the city of Charlottetown was named after. On the inside wall, there are several paintings. The first painting we see is a portrait of Sir John Inglis. He was Lieutenant Colonel in the British Army during the siege of Lucknow. John Inglis came from Halifax. For his action during the siege, he was made a Major General. To the left of the door, there's a portrait of the Queen's grandfather, King George V, done by a famous Canadian artist by the name of Wiley Greer. Immediately underneath this, there is a composite portrait of the last Legislative Council of Nova Scotia. A composite portrait is a watercolor background with individual photographs taken and pasted on. This composite was done immediately prior to the Legislative Council's dissolution in 1928. To the right of the door is a portrait of Thomas Chandler Halliburton. He was a provincial court judge, a member of the Legislative Assembly, and an accomplished author. He is best known for the book The Clockmaker. Sir William Fenwick Williams was a general in the British Army. He was the first governor of Nova Scotia to actually have been born in the province. He came from Annapolis Royal. At the back of the room, there are two portraits, King George I and Queen Caroline. These portraits were a gift from the Earl of Dalhousie on May 31st, 1820. For a period, the portrait of George I was labeled incorrectly. Before we leave this room, I have to invite you to look up. We have the most spectacular ceiling in Halifax. Let's move on to the Legislative Library. When you enter the Legislative Library, you will see this plaque. This plaque depicts the trial of Joseph Howe on a charge of criminal libel. When the building opened in 1819, this room housed the Supreme Court in Nova Scotia. And while it was the Supreme Court, Howe's trial was its most famous. This trial also established freedom of the press in Canada in 1835. Freedom of the press was not written into the Canadian Constitution until the year 1982. If you picture this room as the Supreme Court, imagine the ceiling as high as the Red Chamber. The judge's bench would be approximately where the librarian sits today. The well-to-do in society sat on the floor. The less well-to-do stood in a gallery on the north end of the room. Above the librarian, we see two portraits, Malachi Salter and his wife Susanna. Mr. Salter was a member of our first Legislative Assembly, which met in the year 1758. On the north end of the room, there are three portraits. The first is a photograph of Shirley Elliott, Legislative Librarian from 1954 to 1982. She, in fact, is the person responsible for initially cataloging the library's collection. To the right is a portrait of Edward, Duke of Kent, who was Queen Victoria's father. While he never became king, we are quite proud to hang his portrait here in Nova Scotia. Edward, Duke of Kent, was Commander-in-Chief of the forces in British North America, and while he was here, he directed the building of several structures in Halifax, such as the Town Clock on Citadel Hill, Princess Lodge in Bedford, and Martello Tower in Point Pleasant Park. The final painting in the room is of a retired British naval surgeon by the name of Matthias Hoffman. This portrait was done by an eminent English portrait artist named Jonathan Hopner and is reputed to be the best painting in the building. The library's collection currently houses over 65,000 titles. The oldest book in its collection dates back to the year 1488. It's a Latin book on astrology. The library is most proud of its collections of the journals of the House of Assembly, dating back to the first General Assembly, which met in the year 1758. Moving on, next is the Legislative Chamber. In the Legislative Chamber, you will see that in Nova Scotia we practice a British parliamentary style of government, in that the Speaker sits on the central dais, the government sits to the right, the opposition to the left. To your left is a portrait of Joseph Howe. Howe, as you recall, in 1835 won freedom of the press in Canada. In 1837, he was elected a member of the House of Assembly. While he was a member of the House of Assembly, he successfully campaigned for responsible government. Howe served as a backbench MLA, a cabinet minister, leader of the opposition, Speaker of the House, and Premier of Nova Scotia. He later went on to become a cabinet minister under Sir John A. Macdonald in the federal government, and he died in the office of Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. To your right is an image of James Johnston, who was also a Premier of Nova Scotia. He was appointed Lieutenant Governor after Joseph Howe, but declined to take office due to poor health. Traditionally in Nova Scotia, members have support from the past in the form of a portrait of a former Premier of the province. The Liberals are supported by a portrait of William S. Fielding. The PCs are supported by a portrait of Sir Charles Tupper. Currently, the NDP doesn't have the support of a portrait of a former Premier. Another portrait we have in the room is of the Right Honourable Sir John Thompson. Sir John Thompson, as well as Sir Charles Tupper, were both former premiers of Nova Scotia, who later went on to become prime ministers of the country. Nova Scotia has had the honour and distinction of having 3 prime ministers of the country. R.L. Borden was the 3rd. Tupper's portrait and Thompson's portrait are in the chamber because they were also former premiers of Nova Scotia. While often forgotten as prime minister, Thompson served from 1892 to 1894. An interesting historical note, he died at dinner with Queen Victoria. The The two remaining portraits in the chamber are of Gladys Porter and F. Wayne Adams. These two photographs are representative of the two significant contributions these members have made to the Assembly. Gladys Porter was the first female member elected to serve in the chamber. She served from 1960 to 1967. F. Wayne Adams was the first African Nova Scotian to serve in the chamber. He served from 1993 to 1998. Finally, we have a framed document, which is a copy of the rules and forms of procedures of the House of Assembly. This copy was done in 1784 by Clerk of the House, Richard Cunningham. Today, the rules are considerably more complex. This concludes the tour. We have so much more to offer here at Province House. Come and see for yourself. Our hours of operation are Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. In July and August, we extend our hours to 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And in July and August, Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you.